The saloon lights of Dry Creek flickered dimly that night, casting long shadows across the dusty street. She came stumbling out of the darkness, her dress torn, her feet bare and bleeding from the sharp stones of the trail. Her face was streaked with dust and tears, and the bruises across her arms told a story no words could. When she saw him, the tall rancher with shoulders broad enough to carry the world, her eyes dropped to the ground. "Don't look at me," she whispered, her voice cracked and trembling. But Luke Marston looked. He didn't see the dirt, the bruises, or the shame she thought defined her. He saw the strength it took to stand, the fire still burning faintly in her eyes despite the cruelty she had endured. In that moment, something inside him broke. This wasn't pity, it was reverence. Slowly, almost as if bound by something greater than his own will, the rancher fell to his knees before her. His hat slipped from his hands, and his voice was hushed but steady. "You think you're ruined," he said, "but I've never seen anything more worth fighting for." The town watched in silence from the edges of the boardwalk, whispers curling through the air like smoke. Men who had mocked her now stared in disbelief. Women who had turned away from her suffering felt their throats tighten with guilt. And she, trembling and ashamed, lifted her eyes to see a man kneeling, not to claim her, not to judge her, but to honor her. It was a sight that unsettled the whole town. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of her shame loosen. His gaze didn't burn her, it healed her. She had begged him not to look, but in his eyes she saw not disgust, but desire, fierce and unashamed. It wasn't the hunger of a man seeking to own, but the devotion of a man willing to give. And in that sacred, fragile moment, she understood. Sometimes it wasn't salvation a soul needed, but someone willing to see them as they truly were, and still fall to their knees. The rancher didn't wait for permission from the crowd, nor did he care for their judgment. He rose from his knees, placed his coat gently around her shoulders, and lifted her into his arms as though she weighed no more than a child. Without another word, he carried her down the silent street, past the gas lamps and staring eyes, straight toward his ranch at the edge of town. Every step he took rang out like a challenge. Let them whisper, let them condemn, he had already made his choice. Inside the ranch house, warmth met her like a long-forgotten embrace. The fire in the hearth glowed, the air rich with the scent of cedarwood. He set her down carefully, as if she were something fragile yet priceless, and brought her water, bread, and a basin to wash. She sat trembling, unsure if she should stay, unsure if kindness like this was real. But when she whispered, "Why would you care for me, a woman broken?" his answer was simple, and it shook her to the core. "Because you're not broken, you're alive. And that's enough." Word spread quickly through Dry Creek. By morning, the town was buzzing with talk of the rancher who had carried her home, who had dared to honor what others dismissed. Some scoffed, saying he was a fool blinded by pity. Others, quieter and wiser, admitted envy that he had seen beauty where they had only seen shame. Women lingered by fences, speaking her name in hushed tones, while men shook their heads at Luke's defiance, uncertain whether to laugh or fear what it meant. As days turned to weeks, she healed beneath his roof. The bruises faded, her feet mended, and with every passing night she shed a little more of the fear that had wrapped her soul in chains. Luke never pressed her, never demanded more than she could give. Instead, he worked the ranch with her watching, teaching her to milk the cows, mend a fence, or ride with the sunrise. Slowly, her laughter returned, faint at first, then stronger, like music long silenced finding its voice again. Yet even in the warmth of his care, shadows lingered. The men who had left her bruised had not vanished from Dry Creek. They muttered in saloons, angered by her survival, enraged by the rancher's defiance. And though Luke did not speak of it, he knew the day would come when they would test his resolve, not with whispers, but with violence. Until then, he prepared in silence, every glance toward her a silent vow. No one would hurt her again. The warning came on a stormy night. The wind rattled the shutters, and the fire hissed low in the hearth when the distant sound of horses thundered across the plain. Luke rose from his chair, his jaw set, the familiar weight of his revolver already in his hand. Eliza, her name spoken now without shame, looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. "They're coming, aren't they?" she whispered. He didn't answer, but the way his gaze hardened was reply enough. Moments later, the pounding of fists shook the ranch door. Voices, rough and slurred with drink, shouted through the storm. "She's ours. Send her out, Marston, or we'll burn your house to the ground." Eliza flinched, clutching the edge of his coat as if it could shield her from the memory of their cruelty. Luke stepped closer, his voice low and steady, meant for her ears alone. They don't own you. They never did. And tonight, they'll learn it. He opened the door. Lightning flashed, revealing 5 men on horseback, their faces twisted with malice, their guns gleaming in the rain. Luke stepped out into the mud, bareheaded, his revolver steady at his side. "She's under my roof," he said, his voice carrying over the storm. "And I'll die before I let you lay a hand on her again." The sheer calm in his words, the conviction like steel, made even the boldest of them falter. But their leader sneered, spitting into the mud. "You think you can keep her? She's nothing but dirt we trampled first. You'll learn the hard way." He raised his pistol, and the night exploded into gunfire. Shots cracked through the rain, sparks lighting the dark. Luke moved with a practiced calm, each shot of his revolver precise, his frame unyielding as thunder roared above them. Inside, Eliza crouched near the window, watching with her heart lodged in her throat. Fear clawed at her, but stronger still was something new, fierce, unshakable pride. She was no longer the broken woman who whispered, "Don't look at me." She was the woman a rancher had fallen to his knees for, the woman worth protecting, worth loving. And if he fell tonight, she swore she would not let him fall alone. The storm howled like a beast, swallowing the crack of every shot. Luke ducked behind the water trough, his revolver spitting fire into the dark. One rider fell from his horse, splashing into the mud, while another retreated with a curse, clutching his arm. But still the others pressed forward, bullets chewing through the ranch's wooden posts. Inside, Eliza's hands shook as she clutched the old hunting rifle Luke had once hung above the mantel. She had never fired a gun before, but tonight fear would not cage her. She threw open the window, rain pelting her face, and aimed into the chaos. For a moment, she hesitated, her breath shallow, her finger trembling on the trigger. Then she remembered their fists, their laughter, their cruelty, and the way Luke had knelt for her, seen her, cherished her. She pulled the trigger. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder, but her shot rang true, striking the lantern one of the men held high. Fire spilled across the mud, sending the horses into a frenzy. The sudden blaze turned the tide. Blinded and panicked, 2 of the attackers scrambled to flee, cursing as they disappeared into the storm. Only their leader remained, dismounted and furious, his eyes burning as he charged through the mud toward Luke with a knife. "You'll regret defying us," he bellowed, lunging. Luke parried the strike, the 2 men grappling in the downpour, fists and steel flashing under the lightning's glare. From the window, Eliza's heart stopped as she saw Luke stumble, the knife grazing his side. Without thought, she rushed outside, barefoot in the mud, the rifle clutched tight. "Enough," she cried, her voice raw with fury. The leader froze at the sound, just long enough for Luke to wrench the knife from his hand and throw him to the ground. Eliza stood above them both, the rifle steady in her arms, rain plastering her hair to her face. "You'll never touch me again. Not now, not ever." The man looked into her eyes and saw something far more terrifying than a rifle. He saw a woman who was no longer his victim. With a growl of frustration, he scrambled to his feet and fled into the storm, leaving his pride bleeding in the mud behind him. Luke, breath ragged, rose to his feet beside her. He pressed a hand to his wound, wincing, but when he looked at her, a fierce smile tugged at his lips. "You saved me," he said, his voice hushed, filled with wonder. And for the first time, Eliza felt the truth of it. She wasn't just someone worth saving, she was someone strong enough to save. Morning broke clear and cold, the storm's fury swept away, but its scars remained. The ranch yard was littered with mud, broken wood, and the remnants of lantern fire. Luke's side was bandaged, his strength bruised but unbroken, and Eliza sat beside him on the porch steps, her bare feet resting on the cool boards. For the first time, there was no trembling in her hands. She stared at the horizon, where the men had fled, and knew deep in her bones they would never own her story again. News traveled faster than the storm. By noon, townsfolk rode out to the ranch, curiosity pulling them like moths to flame. They saw the mud, the bullet holes, the blood dried into the earth. They saw Luke upright and steady, Eliza at his side, rifle leaning against the porch rail like a silent declaration. Whispers rose among them, some in awe, others in disbelief. The woman they had once pitied, scorned, or ignored had faced down the very men who had broken her. And she had won. The sheriff, a grizzled man tired of burying fools, tipped his hat toward Luke but fixed his gaze on Eliza. "Town'll be different after this," he said quietly. "You stood when no one else did. His words carried, and for the first time, no one in Dry Creek could look at her and see weakness. They saw the fire she had carried into the storm, the courage that had turned fear into defiance. Some hung their heads in shame for never helping her sooner. Others simply nodded, knowing the balance of power in their dusty town had shifted. That evening, as lanterns lit the streets, Luke walked with Eliza through Dry Creek. Side by side, they moved past the saloon doors where once she'd been mocked, past the boardwalk where she had whispered, "Don't look at me." But now, all eyes were on her. And instead of shame, she carried her chin high, her bruises fading but her strength blazing. For the first time, she met their stares and did not shrink. Instead, she let them see her, every scar, every triumph, every ounce of her truth. Luke reached for her hand, his rough fingers curling around hers. "They'll talk for years about last night," he said softly. "But I don't care about them. I only care about you." Eliza smiled, a quiet, steady smile that silenced the last of her doubts. "Then let them talk," she whispered. "Because for the first time, I'm not afraid of being seen." And with that, they walked forward together, no longer the rancher and the broken woman, but two souls who had remade each other in the storm. In the weeks that followed, Dry Creek spoke of little else. Some claimed Luke Marston had gone mad, risking his life for a woman others had cast aside. But most began to see what had really happened, that Eliza had risen from the ashes of her pain, and that the rancher had only given her the chance to show the strength already inside her. Her name, once whispered with pity, became spoken with respect. She was no longer a shadow in the streets, she was a flame, and the town could not look away. On the ranch, life settled into a rhythm both tender and unyielding. Eliza worked alongside Luke, her hands calloused from chores but her spirit lighter than it had ever been. He never treated her as someone fragile, never caged her in fear of what had been done to her. Instead, he gave her space to grow, to laugh, to challenge him. And when the nights grew quiet, when the prairie wind sang through the grass, he would hold her as though she were the only thing in the wide world that mattered. The men who had once hunted her did not return. Perhaps the storm had broken their courage, or perhaps it was the knowledge that the town itself had turned against them. Either way, their absence left room for something new, peace. Eliza walked through Dry Creek without flinching, and each nod from a passerby, each smile from a stranger, wove her deeper into the life she had thought forever closed to her. One evening, beneath a sky painted in shades of gold and violet, Luke brought her to the hill overlooking the ranch. With the sun sinking low, he dropped to one knee, not in pity, not in worship, but in love. "You told me once not to look at you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I can't stop looking. Not now, not ever. Will you stay, Eliza? Will you let me build a life with you?" Tears blurred her vision, but her answer was steady, filled with the certainty she had fought so hard to find. "Yes, because with you, I'm not broken, I'm whole." And so, the town of Dry Creek carried their story like a legend. They spoke of the barefoot woman who had whispered in shame, and the rancher who knelt not out of pity but out of love. They spoke of the storm that had tested them, the night that had changed everything. But above all, they spoke of the woman who learned to stand tall, and the man who chose her when no one else dared. Under the endless western sky, their love endured, not as a tale of rescue, but as a testament to two souls who found freedom in each other's gaze. Years slipped by, and the scars of that stormy night faded into memory, though never forgotten. Eliza and Luke's ranch grew strong, its fences stretching wider, its fields richer each season. Neighbors came seeking help, advice, and sometimes just the warmth of their fire. Where once she had been pitied or scorned, Eliza became known as a woman of wisdom and courage. Folks said she carried the strength of the desert in her heart, and they meant it as the highest praise. Children often ran to her porch, eager to hear her stories of survival. She never spoke of her pain in detail, but she told them how storms could be endured, how bruises didn't define a soul, and how even the weakest could rise stronger than those who sought to break them. Luke would listen quietly, pride shining in his eyes, knowing that her voice was changing the town more than his gun ever had. Dry Creek itself changed, too. The sheriff grew old and retired, but the town no longer needed a heavy hand. Men thought twice before raising fists, knowing that the memory of Eliza's rifle and Luke's stand still lingered like a shadow across the saloon. Women walked with their chins higher, some even finding the courage to leave cruel husbands, citing Eliza as proof that no chain was unbreakable. At night, when the chores were done and the prairie was quiet, Luke and Eliza would sit on the hill above their ranch, watching the stars scatter across the velvet sky. He still teased her that he had fallen to his knees the first night they met, and she would laugh softly, reminding him that it had been no joke, it had been the moment her life began again. And though time added lines to their faces and silver to their hair, the fire between them never dimmed. In the end, their story outlived them both. The tale of the barefoot woman and the kneeling rancher became part of Dry Creek's history, told around campfires and passed down through generations. Some embellished it, some softened it, but the truth remained. They had turned shame into strength, and love into legend. And in every whisper of the wind across the plains, it was as though the land itself remembered them, not as broken souls, but as the ones who taught a town the meaning of true courage. One autumn, long after peace had settled into Dry Creek, trouble rode in from the north. A band of drifters, hard men with restless eyes, arrived on the heels of rumor. They had heard stories of the barefoot woman who had tamed a town, and they came not with awe, but with scorn. To them, such tales were an invitation to break what others had built. They swaggered through the saloon, mocking the townsfolk, daring anyone to defy them. The people of Dry Creek looked toward the ranch, waiting for the shadow of Luke Marston to appear. When word reached the ranch, Eliza didn't wait for her husband to saddle his horse. She strapped on her rifle and rode into town herself, dust rising behind her. The drifters laughed when they saw her, one bruised woman against 5 hardened men. But the townsfolk who lined the streets didn't laugh. They remembered her courage, the night she had stood bloody and unbroken. And when she leveled her rifle at the leader's chest, the laughter died in their throats. "You don't belong here," she said, her voice calm as steel. Luke arrived moments later, but he didn't take the rifle from her hands. Instead, he stood behind her, silent and steady, letting everyone see the truth. This wasn't just his fight. It was hers. The drifters shifted uneasily, realizing that the weight of the whole town pressed against them, not just one man and his wife. What had begun as a game soured quickly. With muttered curses, they mounted their horses and rode out, leaving the dust of Dry Creek behind. That night, the townsfolk gathered outside the saloon, torches flickering against the cool air. They cheered for Luke, yes, but louder still for Eliza. Women clasped her hands with tears in their eyes, men tipped their hats with quiet respect, and children clung to her skirts as though she were the embodiment of safety itself. Dry Creek had seen ranchers and sheriffs come and go, but never a woman who stood taller than her own past. From then on, her legend grew even larger. Folks no longer whispered just about the night Luke had fallen to his knees, they spoke of the day Eliza faced down 5 armed men and sent them packing with nothing but her will and her rifle. And in that moment, the couple's love story became more than a tale of survival. It became the backbone of a town, proof that sometimes the fiercest warriors are forged not in glory, but in pain, and that true power lies in those who rise after they've been broken. Years rolled on, and the Marston Ranch became more than a homestead, it became the beating heart of Dry Creek. Luke and Eliza grew older, but their fire never dimmed. Their children, however, were a different kind of storm. Samuel, their eldest, had his father's broad shoulders and steady patience, while their daughter Clara carried her mother's fierce spirit, eyes sharp as an eagle's, and hands that never shook. From the time she could walk, Clara followed Eliza everywhere, learning not just how to mend fences or saddle horses, but how to stare down the world when it tried to tell her she was less. By the time Clara turned 16, whispers of her boldness had spread as far as the cattle trails. Some said she was too wild for her own good, others said she was the future of Dry Creek. Suitors rode in, all hoping to tame her, but she sent them packing with a smile that mirrored her mother's. "If you're looking for a girl who bows, you're in the wrong town," she'd say, leaving men red-faced and sputtering. Eliza watched with quiet pride, remembering the girl she used to be before shame had broken her. Clara was the proof of what healing and love could create, unyielding strength. Trouble, of course, was never far. One spring, cattle rustlers struck along the edge of the ranch, testing the family's hold on the land. Luke, older now but still formidable, saddled up with Samuel. But when Clara insisted on riding too, Eliza said nothing to stop her. Instead, she handed her daughter the same rifle she had once raised in the face of 5 men. "This isn't just iron and wood," she told her. "It's a piece of your mother's will. Use it wisely." Clara grinned, eyes flashing. "Don't worry, Mama, I'll make them remember the Marstons." The fight was swift and brutal, with dust and hooves clouding the air. Clara rode like a fury, her shots sharp and unerring, driving the thieves back across the border. Samuel fought with his father's discipline, while Luke himself held the line like a mountain. By the end, the rustlers fled in shame, leaving behind cattle and wounded pride. Word of the battle traveled fast, and by sundown, Dry Creek was buzzing with the tale of a girl who fought like her mother and bore her father's unbreakable will. That night, as the stars rose, Luke sat by the fire with Eliza, his arm around her shoulders. Clara and Samuel laughed nearby, the weight of victory still fresh. "Do you see it, Eliza?" Luke asked softly. "Our story, it isn't just ours anymore. They'll carry it further than we ever dreamed." Eliza smiled, resting her head against his chest. "Yes," she whispered, "we bled so they could stand tall. Now the land will remember not just us, but them." And with that, the Marston legacy was sealed, not as a tale of one man or one woman, but as a family who taught the frontier that love and courage could build more than fences. It could build legends. The summer after the rustlers were driven off, Clara began riding farther than she ever had before. The wide plains seemed to call her, whispering promises of freedom and danger alike. Samuel warned her often that the frontier was no place for reckless wandering, but Clara's blood burned too hot for caution. One evening, she returned home with her braid wind-tossed and eyes alight. "There's a camp upriver," she told Samuel. "Drifters, maybe outlaws. They were watching me." Samuel frowned, knowing what it meant. Trouble was circling Dry Creek again. The next day, Luke and Samuel rode out to scout the camp, but Clara followed in secret. From the cover of mesquite trees, she saw what her father and brother couldn't. These weren't simple outlaws. Among the men was a figure dressed in a black duster, his face half hidden by a wide-brim hat. When Clara crept closer, she heard him speak. His voice was cold and commanding. "Dry Creek's grown soft. A woman's rifle shouldn't frighten anyone. We'll take the ranch first. Break them, and the town will follow." Clara's blood chilled. They weren't here to steal, they were here to conquer. That night, she burst into the ranch house, breathless with urgency. Luke and Eliza listened in silence as she recounted every word. Luke's jaw tightened, but Eliza's eyes sharpened like steel. "They think we're weak because of me," she said softly. "Because of the night I stood alone." Clara touched her mother's hand, shaking her head. "No, Mama, they're afraid of us. That's why they talk of breaking us first." Samuel added, "Then we'll remind them who we are." Together, preparations began in secret. Samuel trained the ranch hands, drilling them with rifles and strategy. Clara rode into town, gathering allies, women who had once looked to her mother for courage, young men eager to prove themselves, even old-timers who still remembered the night Luke had knelt in the dust for Eliza. By the week's end, Dry Creek was no longer a quiet settlement. It was a fortress of determination, united by the legacy of one family. And when the outlaws finally struck, riding hard with guns blazing, they were met not by a town of cowards but by a wall of defiance. Shots cracked through the night, voices shouted in unison, and at the heart of it stood Clara with her mother's rifle and Samuel with his father's steady aim. Luke and Eliza stood together on the porch, not as warriors, but as proud witnesses. They had fought their battles years ago, but now their children carried the fire, and the frontier itself seemed to tremble under the weight of the Marston name. The outlaws thundered down the main street of Dry Creek just after dusk, their torches casting wild shadows against the wooden storefronts. Horses screamed, windows shattered, and the air filled with the acrid scent of smoke and gunpowder. At the head rode the man in the black duster, his revolver glinting in the torchlight. "Burn it down," he roared, his voice carrying like a curse. But before they could fan out, Clara stepped into the open, rifle leveled, her braid whipping in the wind. One clean shot rang out, and the torch in the leader's hand exploded into sparks. "Not tonight," she shouted, her voice sharp as a whip crack. The town erupted. Samuel, hidden with a dozen ranch hands on the rooftops, opened fire with precision. Bullets tore through the dust, knocking out riders one by one. Women armed with shotguns and pistols burst from alleyways, their faces fierce with defiance. Old Mr. Tate, who had barely walked in years, wheeled his chair onto the boardwalk and fired both barrels of his shotgun into the night. The outlaws, expecting fear, found themselves drowning in fury. The man in the black duster cursed and charged forward, his eyes locked on Clara. She met him head-on, standing her ground as hooves pounded closer. At the last second, she dropped to one knee, firing up through the haze. His horse screamed and buckled, sending him crashing into the dirt. The town cheered, but Clara didn't pause. She swung her rifle, knocking another outlaw off his saddle, then reloaded with the speed her mother had taught her. Samuel's steady shots kept her covered, their bond unspoken but unbreakable. On the porch of the ranch house, Eliza clutched Luke's arm, her heart torn between fear and pride. "She's too bold," she whispered. Luke shook his head, his weathered face calm. "She's you," he said simply. And as Clara stood over the fallen outlaw leader, rifle steady, Luke knew the truth: this was no longer his fight. The frontier belonged to his children now. The battle ended as swiftly as it had begun. The surviving outlaws scattered into the night, their bravado shattered, their leader lying bruised and broken in the dust. Dry Creek stood battered but unbowed, flames smothered by buckets of water and hands that refused to quit. Clara lowered her rifle at last, her chest heaving, her braid falling loose around her shoulders. Samuel joined her, his steady hand resting on her shoulder. Together they looked to the townsfolk, who raised their voices in a roar of triumph. The Marston family hadn't just defended Dry Creek, they had secured its soul for another generation. The dust settled by morning. Dry Creek bore its scars, shattered windows, bullet holes splintering the saloon doors, smoke stains rising from smoldering boards. But it also stood taller than ever before, a town forged in fire and defiance. At the center of it all lay the outlaw leader, bound at the wrists, his black duster torn and streaked with blood. Clara had been the one to tie the knots herself, her hands steady, her eyes unflinching. He spat curses at her feet, but the venom no longer stung. She had faced him in the firelight and won. The townsfolk gathered in the square, the weight of justice heavy in the morning air. Some called for the outlaw to be hanged then and there, a warning to anyone who dared test Dry Creek again. Others urged caution, reminding all that law, not vengeance, was what separated them from the chaos of the frontier. It was Clara who stepped forward, her voice carrying above the shouts. "He wanted us broken," she said firmly. "If we hang him without trial, we become what he said we were, weak, lawless. But if we stand together and hold him to justice, we show the world we're stronger than fear." The crowd fell silent, her words echoing in the hush. Even the sheriff, long past his prime, tipped his hat and said, "The girl's right. Let the law ride in and see this man judged." For the first time, Clara felt not like a child in her parents' shadow but like a voice the town itself would follow. Pride burned in Samuel's eyes as he placed a hand on her shoulder, and Luke and Eliza exchanged a look that said everything: the torch had been passed. In the days that followed, Dry Creek repaired its wounds. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now worked side by side, patching roofs, mending fences, and sweeping away the wreckage. Clara found herself at the center of it all, organizing, encouraging, even scolding when needed. She was no longer just the fiery rancher's daughter. She had become a leader in her own right. And when children clung to her skirts, asking breathlessly how she had faced the outlaw with such courage, she smiled the same way her mother once had and told them, "Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's standing tall while your knees shake." As the outlaw leader was hauled away in chains days later, Dry Creek gathered again in the square. They didn't cheer, nor did they jeer. They stood tall, united, watching as the man who had sought to break them disappeared into the horizon. In that moment, Clara knew their victory wasn't just in the battle, but in the choice to rise above vengeance. Dry Creek had become something more than a frontier town. It was a community bound by love, courage, and the Marston legacy.